Welcome back to the In the Game Room podcast, presented by GC Mini. We're grabbing our dice and rule books as we deep dive into a crucial aspect of Bolt Action V3, unit types.
That's right. Whether you're a seasoned general or just deploying your first army, understanding how different units function is going to be key to securing those hard-fought tabletop victories.
Okay, so before we send our troops headlong into the chaos of battle,
Mm.
let's break down the basics. What are we actually looking at when we talk about units in Bolt Action?
Well, think about those little plastic soldiers on your tabletop. The most common unit you'll be working with is the infantry section or squad. This usually represents a group of 5 to 10 soldiers moving and fighting as a single cohesive unit.
So instead of individually directing every single soldier, I'm giving orders to these small squads. That makes sense. But what about the heavier firepower? I'm assuming a tank isn't running around with a whole squad crammed inside.
Good point. That's where we get into single model units. Things like tanks, armored cars. Even those big artillery pieces, they pack enough punch to be their own unit.
Ah, so it's not just about boots on the ground then. Got it. Now, Bolt Action doesn't just lump all these units together, does it? There have to be some categories to help us make sense of it all.
Absolutely. Bolt Action breaks down units into 3 main types: infantry, artillery, and vehicles. Each one has its strengths and weaknesses, which adds a layer of tactical depth to your army building and decision-making on the battlefield.
Okay, let's start with the heart of most armies, infantry. Now, this might seem like the simplest unit type, but I have a feeling there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're right to be cautious. While we often think of infantry as soldiers on foot, Bolt Action broadens the definition a bit. We're talking bicycles, motorcycles, even cavalry units. If they primarily fight dismounted, they're considered infantry.
So even if they ride into battle on horseback, they still fall under the infantry umbrella.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Those mounts are more about getting them into position quickly. For example, think about the British Airborne Infantry Squad. They're often depicted with bicycles, but you wouldn't expect them to charge a tank on 2 wheels, right?
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
They'd use their bikes for speed and maneuverability, but dismount for actual combat. So it's less about how they get around and more about how they engage the enemy.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the tactical purpose of each unit. Now, let's shift our focus to those big guns everyone loves. Artillery.
Artillery.
Yeah.
This is where things get really explosive, right? I'm picturing howitzers, cannons, anything that can deliver a devastating blow from afar.
You've got it. And just like with infantry, there are strategic nuances to keep in mind. Firstly, remember, an artillery unit isn't just the gun itself. It also includes the crew needed to operate it, so you need to factor in their protection as well.
Okay, so I can't just plonk down a cannon and call it a day. I need to make sure those gunners are safe and sound. What else should I be thinking about when it comes to artillery?
Positioning. Positioning is key. Artillery, by its very nature, is slow and cumbersome. You wouldn't want to deploy your guns too close to the enemy lines, only to have them overrun before they can unleash their firepower, would you?
Absolutely not. So if I need to reposition my artillery in a hurry, I'm guessing that's not going to be easy.
You're right to be concerned. They can be manhandled into new positions, but it's a slow process, leaving them vulnerable to counterattacks. Of course, you can always tow them with a vehicle, but that adds another layer of tactical complexity.
Makes sense. Speaking of vehicles, let's dive into the part of Bolt Action that gets everyone's engines revving. Vehicles. And I'm not just talking tanks here, am I?
Not at all. Bolt Action's vehicle category covers a wide range of mechanized units. You've got your jeeps, trucks, armored cars, self-propelled guns, tank destroyers, the list goes on.
So we're talking about a whole motorized division at my disposal. What are some of the key things to remember about fielding vehicles in Bolt Action?
Well, unlike infantry units, which are usually represented by several models, a vehicle is typically represented on the battlefield by a single model.
So when I see a lone German Panzer the Filth rolling across the battlefield, it's not just a tank going solo.
Exactly. That single model represents a full crew and the collective firepower of the vehicle. Think about it as a microcosm of armored might. You've got the driver, the gunner, the commander. They all play a part in how effective that tank will be in battle.
That's a great point. It adds a whole new level of depth to the game when you realize that even a single model can represent a complex unit with multiple crew members.
Precisely. And that same principle applies to other single-model units as well. Take a Soviet anti-tank team, for instance. It's more than just a gun on the tabletop. It represents a group of soldiers working together to operate that weapon, each with their own role to play.
This is starting to sound like a lot to keep track of, but in the best way possible. Before we move on to how these units move and fight on the battlefield, what about those units that blur the lines a bit? Something like a US M36 Jackson tank destroyer. It's powerful, but it's not technically a tank.
Excellent question. The M36 Jackson perfectly highlights the diversity within the vehicle category. While it might not fit the traditional image of a tank, it functions as a single model vehicle unit in bolt action, reflecting its specialized role as a tank killer.
So even though there are different classes and roles within the vehicle category, they all function as independent units on the board. That clears up a lot. Now we've got all these units ready for battle. But how do we make sure they're not tripping over each other on the tabletop?
That's where the concepts of bases and formations come into play. You're right to bring that up, Henry. Bases and formations are key to understanding how your units physically interact on the battlefield. Think of it as adding a sense of order to the chaos of wargaming.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's talk bases first. We talk about those little plastic stands most miniatures come with.
Exactly. In bolt action, most individual models are mounted on a 25mm diameter base. This serves a couple of purposes. Firstly, it provides a standardized footprint for each model, which helps with measuring distances and maintaining a sense of visual scale on the battlefield.
So each model has its own little circle of influence, so to speak. What about larger weapons or artillery pieces? They must need a bit more space than a single 25mm base, right?
You're sharp as ever, Henry. You're right. Those bulkier units might use a single larger base, or even multiple bases depending on their size and how they're modeled. But the core concept remains the same. It's about creating a realistic and consistent representation of each unit's physical presence on the table.
That makes sense. Now, what about formations? I can't just have my brave soldiers running around like a group of chickens with their heads cut off.
Yeah.
How do we keep things organized, tactically speaking?
Well, bolt action isn't quite as strict as historical formations, but it does have rules about unit coherency. Essentially, this means your multi-model units need to stay relatively close together when they move.
So no sending my brave scouts sprinting miles ahead of the squad then. I guess teamwork really does make the dream work.
Exactly. And there's a simple rule to help you remember this, the 1-inch rule.
Mm-hmm.
All models in a unit must stay within 1 inch of each other when they move.
1 inch? That's pretty close. I can see how that would encourage a more coordinated approach to movement.
Precisely. This rule ensures your units act as a cohesive force, benefiting from each other's support and firepower. It makes your squads more resilient and prevents them from becoming easy pickings for the enemy.
So it's like having safety in numbers, even on a miniature scale. But you mentioned something earlier about a gap between units. What's the deal with this 1 inch gap?
Yes. This is another key rule that often trips up new players. Basically, it means that when a unit finishes its move, it needs to be at least 1 inch away from any other unit, whether it's friend or foe.
So no huddling together for pre-battle pep talk. Yeah, no problem. But seriously, why is that 1 inch gap so important?
Think about it like this, Henry. Imagine a battlefield where units are clumped together, almost on top of each other. It would be chaotic. This rule keeps the battlefield fluid and prevents units from getting bogged down in a messy scrum.
It's all starting to make sense now. It's like creating breathing room for tactical maneuvers.
Exactly. It forces you to think strategically about your unit placement and movement. You need to be mindful of not just your own positioning, but also how your units are interacting with both friendly and enemy forces. It adds a whole other layer of depth to the game.
It sounds like a subtle rule, but with some major tactical implications. So I have to ask, what about assaults? Surely my troops don't have to politely stay an inch away when they're charging into hand-to-hand combat.
You raise a very good point, Henry. When it comes to close quarters combat, those rules relax a little. When a unit is making an assault, they can move into direct contact with the enemy, ignoring that usual 1 inch gap.
Okay, so when it's time to get stuck in, all bets are off. I like it. But I'm guessing there's a whole other set of rules governing what happens when those units collide in a flurry of bayonets and grenades.
You'd be right. Close combat is a whole other beast with its own set of exciting rules and tactical considerations. Perhaps something we can explore in another deep dive.
I'm already looking forward to it. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've got our infantry, our artillery, our vehicles, all with their unique strengths and weaknesses. And we've learned about the importance of bases and formations and keeping our armies organized and those battles running smoothly. But I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. We've covered the foundation, but there's always another layer of strategy to uncover in bolt action, isn't there? You've also got terrain to consider, line of sight, unit special rules, not to mention those all-important order dice. Each roll of the dice introduces an element of unpredictability, forcing you to adapt your plans on the fly.
Okay, that's what those hefty rule books are for. I'm starting to see how all these elements weave together
Yeah.
to create such a rich and engaging wargaming experience.
Exactly. Bolt action is like a complex puzzle where every piece interacts with the others. But even with all these intricacies, knowing the strengths and limitations of each unit type is fundamental to success.
It's like you always say, to command effectively, you need to understand the tools at your disposal.
Well said. Think about it this way. You wouldn't throw a lone infantry squad at a heavily armored tank without a solid plan, would you? You need to choose the right unit for the job and utilize their strengths effectively.
Unless I was feeling particularly daring.
Hmm.
Or perhaps a little foolish. But you've hit the nail on the head. Knowing how and when to deploy each unit is what sets apart a green commander from a seasoned veteran.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that every unit has a role to play on the battlefield, from the humble infantry squad holding the line to the thundering tank leading the charge.
This has been a fantastic overview. So to recap for our listeners, Bolt Action V3 has 3 primary unit types: infantry, artillery, and vehicles, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and tactical uses. We've also learned about the importance of bases and formations in ensuring our miniature armies maneuver with precision and a touch of realism.
Excellently summarized. Understanding these core concepts is essential. Whether you're a newcomer dipping your toes into the world of bolt action or a veteran general fine-tuning your strategies,
If you're looking to build your Bolt Action armies, pick up the latest rulebooks. Or just find a community of like-minded wargamers. Be sure to check out GC Mini.
they've got everything you need to conquer those tabletop battlefields.
Absolutely. And be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into the thrilling world of Bolt Action V3, right here on the In the Game Room podcast.
Until then, happy gaming, everyone.